Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Greg Gilbert, and I am a professor in environmental studies at UC Santa Cruz, and I will be your host for this evening. Like our speaker tonight, I study tropical forest ecology, and I've known and collaborated with our speaker, Karen Holl, for more than 20 years. The UCSC University Forum is an ongoing series focusing on the relevance of our research to the community and to social, economic, and environmental and political issues, proudly featuring the impact of research conducted at UC Santa Cruz. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few details about the event tonight. We are using a webinar tool, so there is no chat function. We will have an opportunity to answer your questions at the end of the program, and we invite you to submit your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Tonight's event will be recorded. Karen Holl is a professor of environmental studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her research focuses on understanding how local and landscape scale processes affect ecosystem recovery from human disturbance and using this information to restore damaged ecosystems. She studies rainforest restoration in Latin America and chaparral, grassland, and riparian systems in California. She oversees a long-term tropical research restoration study in southern Costa Rica and has worked with students and collaborators in Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and Panama. She is the author of the Primer of Ecological Restoration in 2020. She also was the 2017 co-winner of the Theodore Sperry Award of the Society for Ecological Restoration and was elected as a fellow of both the California Academy of Sciences and the Ecological Society of America. And she is the holder of the University of California MacArthur Foundation Chair. She has served as chair of the Environmental Studies Department at UCSC and as faculty director of the Kenneth S. Norris Center for Natural History. Please welcome Professor Karen Holl as she shares with us her work on improving outcomes of tree growing and forest restoration efforts.
Thanks, Greg, for that introduction. Can you hear me okay? Greg, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay, thanks. Okay, let me just make sure I get my screen shared okay, and then we'll get started. Okay, are you seeing my screen okay?
It looks great.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so thanks, Greg, for the introduction, and to all of you for being here today. There will be two parts to my talk today. The first half, I'll talk about the massive tree planting, trillion tree campaigns proposed globally that have received a lot of attention in the media, and what I think we could do to improve those efforts. And then I'll focus in the second half on my own research on tropical forest restoration. A lot of my examples today will be about tropical forests. That's partly because that's where a lot of the planting efforts are right now, and also because that's where I do a lot of my forest restoration research, but I'll also talk about some examples in the temperate zone. And throughout this, I'd like to acknowledge that I have a lot of collaborators and many, many students who have worked with me. So the results of this work are not only my own, but are very much due to the people with whom I work. And so I'll refer to us as we today. So there are many forest restoration and tree planting campaigns. Let's see, I'm trying to. Greg, are you seeing the share bar at the Zoom bar at the top of my screen or no?
No, it looks great. It's full screen.
Okay, so it's
looks
just
awesome.
at my end. Okay, hopefully. Okay, so there are many forest restoration and tree planting campaigns globally. I can't quite get this to hide. Oh well, we'll just leave it there. Okay. So there are many forest restoration and tree planting campaigns globally. One of the first is the Bond Challenge, which aims to restore 350 million hectares globally by 2030. That's an area the size of India. We recently embarked on the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, which aims to restore ecosystems throughout the globe. There are at least 3 trillion tree planting campaigns, one by the World Economic Forum and others by different non-governmental organizations. And those are underlain by tree planting efforts on the orders of millions to billions of trees that are sponsored at the local, regional, and national level, including multiple bills that have been considered in the US Congress to support the 1 Trillion Trees Act. So it's exciting that there's this much interest in tree planting, but where is it all coming from? I think the answer to that is fairly clear. People have been bombarded with messages from scientists in the media about environmental destruction for decades. And all of a sudden they hear that, wow, people are presented with a simple solution that they can relate to. Tree planting has mind-blowing potential to tackle the climate crisis. This message has come from some scientists, come from the popular media, it's come from YouTubers, businessmen, politicians. And the idea has captured the imagination of the world as a practical and easy way to solve some of the most challenging threats ever facing humanity. But then fairly quickly, the critiques have come. Well, maybe planting 1 trillion trees might not actually be such a good idea. And I've been part of that critique. I don't think that tree planting is a simple solution to these problems. There are certainly benefits to tree planting, but we need to be realistic about what we can achieve and do a better job of implementing and maintaining those efforts. So what is the critique? In a nutshell, tree planting can have many benefits if well planned. It can enhance carbon and water storage. It can increase landscape connectivity and native biodiversity. It can also engage stakeholders, and in certain areas where people live off the land, it can enhance livelihoods. But if tree planting is not done thoughtfully, it can also have a number of potential negative benefits. There are documented examples of where extensive areas of trees have been planted in arid systems and the water yield has been reduced. There are a lot of concerns about the destruction of planting trees into treeless habitats and so destroying native grasslands. There's also the potential for the spread of invasive tree species outside the reforested habitats. And in some cases, tree planting has actually led to social conflicts, or in the worst case scenario, actually displacement of farmland. And what I mean by that is that if we start planting trees in areas that people are used for agriculture, there's the potential that then those people will go and clear more forests, so you actually don't have a net positive effect. There's also a lot of concern about these tree planting efforts because in some cases, there's been quite a few failures. And a lot of that has been due to poor planning and top-down projects that have led to disappointing outcomes. In some cases, those disappointing outcomes have to do with the fact that trees were, the wrong species of trees were planted or the trees weren't maintained over time. In the worst case scenarios, there's actually been cases where there have been top-down efforts and countries have come in or governments have planted trees where the local peoples aren't on board. And then those people have protested and actually pulled the trees out. So my goal as a scientist, and I've spent quite a bit of time talking to the media over the last year and writing about this, is not to say that planting trees is good or bad. I think there's a lot of benefits to tree planting and more broadly to ecosystem restoration as a restoration ecologist. But my goal is to think about how we could improve the outcomes of those efforts over space and time. And particularly, I've been trying to change the narrative from tree planting to tree growing for a few reasons. First of all, planting trees is an action. It's not an endpoint. It doesn't say why you're planting trees, which is what I'll talk a little more about as we go. We also need to think about the longer term. It's not just going about and digging a hole and putting a tree in the ground, because if we want to get a benefit from these tree planting efforts, then we really need to think about whether those trees survive over time, because it's going to take 10, 20 years, a century before we really get the benefits that we want. And the other reason I talk about tree growing is because sometimes, in a lot of cases, actually, you don't have to plant the trees for the trees to grow, as I'll also talk about as we go along. So just a note too, that tree growing is one of what are often called many natural climate solutions. And those are conservation, restoration, or improved land management actions that aim to increase carbon storage or to avoid greenhouse gas emissions at ecosystems around the globe. And so there's a lot of different ways that we can sequester more carbon in natural ecosystems. There's a lot of potential in wetland and mangrove restoration. And here in the San Francisco Bay Area, lots of opportunities for wetlands that sequester a lot of carbon in the soil. peatland restoration. There's also options for improving agroforestry and grazing management. So we don't just need to be thinking about trees, but there's also other options, though my focus will be on trees today. So in thinking about tree growing as a solution, and particularly to climate change, which is most commonly proposed for, there's a couple of points that I think are really key to make. Tree growing and other natural climate solutions are not a substitute for greenhouse gas emissions. As the new IPCC report made very clear the report that came out yesterday, we need to be taking immediate and drastic reductions in fossil fuel emissions. We should have been doing it a long time ago. And so this is the key to slowing climate change. Tree planting is one tool in the toolbox, but it's not going to solve the problem. We aren't going to plan a way out of climate change. And if you look at from the last IPCC report, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, about a quarter of the emissions come from agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. So there is some potential there, but what we really need to be doing is reducing our consumption, shifting to alternative energy, driving less, and really transitioning over to a sustainable energy economy. And as I said, reducing our consumption. When you look at the emissions, there definitely is a role, and we need to be using every tool in the toolbox for natural climate solutions to help. And there's a lot of debate about how much we can reduce from natural climate solutions, but it's a small portion of the overall. And so we need to be doing it most certainly, but not on its own. The other reason that tree growing is not a substitute for reducing greenhouse gas emissions is that when we emit carbon dioxide and other fossil fuels into the atmosphere, it stays there for centuries to millennia. But we don't know that the trees that we grow or other ecosystems that we restore are going to be permanent. There's a lot of questions about, humans could cut those trees down again, whether those trees will grow in a future warmer, drier climate. As we all well know, along the Central California coast, wildfire and other, there's other biotic agents that are breaking out. And we know that even before the fires last year, that the frequency of fire in the Western United States has increased substantially over the last 20 years and will continue to do so. And this means that whatever we plant, there's no guarantee it's going to stay there. So that what we need to do is not put those fossil fuel emissions in the atmosphere to begin with. The second thing to know about tree growing to mitigate climate change is that a much higher priority should be to reduce drivers of deforestation and to protect existing forests, which will have immediate and larger climate benefits and co-benefits than tree planting. I'm a restoration ecologist. That's what I've spent my life doing. And I'll be the first to tell you that we cannot completely restore the exact ecosystem that was there before. And we're much better off protecting those ecosystems that we have. The other thing is that with tree planting or other restoration, there's a time lag. With our existing ecosystems, we have the carbon and biodiversity and the other benefits now, whereas we have to wait to get those benefits if we plant trees. And the other thing that's important about maintaining our existing ecosystems is they serve as sources of plants and animals that can help us to restore other ecosystems. So what does reducing the drivers of deforestation mean? That means things like reducing the amount of area. Large areas of tropical forest are cleared for beef and for soy, which is often fed to farm animals, to livestock. And so that means thinking about our diets and eating lower on the food chain. Oil palm has cleared lots of areas in the Asian tropics have been cleared for oil palm. And so thinking about the types of products that we use and that they're deforestation-free palm oil, and where we get the types of timber that we use too, because those are what are causing a lot of their complex effects. The other thing that we need to be careful about is that reforestation programs don't actually encourage deforestation. And unfortunately, there was an article this year that some of Mexico's tree planting programs have actually encouraged deforestation because people are paid to plant trees and then they're clearing forests. But not to point the finger elsewhere, we have similar types of debates in the United States where there's been a lot of debates about whether to protect the Tongass forest in Alaska, which is old growth, temperate rainforest that stores a huge amount of carbon, and a lot of discussion, particularly under the Trump administration, of logging there, when at the same time, we're talking about planting new seedlings that it's going to take years to sequester that amount of carbon. So we need to make sure that there aren't disincentives to protecting existing forests. So a lot of my work is thinking about how do we improve the outcomes of tree growing campaigns over space and time? And what that means is thinking about, first of all, why we are planting trees. There's a lot of different reasons that people plant trees that I'll talk about. Where we're planting trees. We want to be planting trees into areas that were previously had trees that were forested, not into habitats that were formerly treeless, like open wetlands or grasslands or savannas. Thinking about what the land's being used for now, because if we displace that, it could be used elsewhere. And also probably choosing lands that are steeper, are less productive, so that they're less likely to be re-cleared for agriculture. And then thinking about how we go about growing trees. And I'll talk a little bit more about that too. So first, why do people plant trees? Well, people plant trees, first of all, as we've been talking about, to sequester carbon. Also around here, people talk about preventing erosion and accelerating recovery after fires. There's a lot of focus on conserving diversity and restoring forests, which is a lot of what my research is about. In other cases, people are planting trees to provide shade and increase green spaces in cities. And in other cases, they're planting them in productive lands to be able to earn money. And there are many more reasons. And what's important to understand is that it's important to clearly state what the goal is, because there are trade-offs between these different uses and how you go about doing the tree growing or the forest restoration efforts. So as an example of that, I want to talk about potential conflicting goals and the need to coordinate them across scales. I'll use an example from the Brazilian Atlantic Forest. And just to situate you here, the Brazilian Atlantic Forest is located in southeastern Brazil. It is a very diverse habitat. It was logged mostly 200 to 300 years ago when after the Portuguese colonized. So it's an area that's been heavily deforested, and there are extensive efforts to restore it. And that's quite different than the dynamics in the Amazon over here on the western side, where right now the focus is on preventing logging and forest fires to keep the forest standing. So in this area, and where I collaborate with my collaborator, Pedro Brancaleon, who's from this area, there's a number of different groups that are involved in trying to either providing support or different stakeholders at different scales that are interested in restoration of the Atlantic forest. And they have different goals. So you have these international groups that are trying to sequester carbon, either trying to offset carbon emissions from the developed world or for even internally to Brazil to meet their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Accord. You have other groups that are interested in carbon, but also conserving biodiversity. And so there's a lot of NGOs there focused on that. At the national level, there is a Brazilian forest code that's variably enforced, but a lot of the focus there is on improving water quality and particularly restoring along waterways. But the actual restoration or tree growing is done at the site level, mostly on people's farms. And you can imagine that a farmer probably wants to plant trees that are going to provide food, firewood, and income. And so you have all these different goals here, and it may not be that the same species of tree that are going to provide food or firewood are the same ones that you need to conserve biodiversity or to sequester carbon. And there can be win-wins, but it requires coordination. And the way that they've done this in the Brazilian Atlantic Forest is through the Brazilian Atlantic Forest Pact, which is a group of over 270 non-profit government, academic groups, and businesses that have been working together to develop best practices for restoration, coordinate some of the different goals between the international and the local level. They provide training and capacity building, monitoring, and sharing of best practices. And this is the sort of thing that we need to be able to resolve these, to really do restoration successfully, to include stakeholders at different scales, and also to resolve these different goals. So in order to improve tree growing, we need to clearly define and agree on project goals, integrate decision-making across scales, as I mentioned, and that requires an inclusive planning process to tailor tree growing strategies to project goals and to improve success. And a few of the many questions that need to be addressed in this planning process, and we had a paper last year about this as a long table, but just the short version is, first of all, what is the most appropriate strategy for growing trees? And even whether we need to plant trees. So we know that the most cost-effective and ecologically sound method of growing trees is to let nature take its course. In the tropics, this means often dispersal of seeds by animals. In the temperate zone, there's more wind-dispersed seeds, or often species resprout. And we know that this can be a pretty effective way for some forests, not all forests, to recover, such as this example of after 3 years in former shifting agriculture in the Yucatan Peninsula, or looking at some of the regeneration that we see after fires here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, that maybe it isn't necessary to go out and plant trees. This creates a more heterogeneous forest, and it costs a lot less and there's a lot less human intervention. So there's a continuum of ways of growing, of ways to grow trees. So as I said, one way to do that is natural regeneration, which actually this is a picture of the eastern hardwood forest in the United States, much of which on the eastern coast of the United States, the forest has regenerated with no human intervention. Another thing that can be done is to assist natural regeneration. So what this looks like sometimes in the tropics is clearing around seedlings that establish naturally to reduce competition. In Africa, there's a lot of farmer-managed natural regeneration where the farmers manage resprouts on their land and incorporate them in their farming. Here in the Santa Cruz Mountains after fire, that might look like something perhaps not planting everywhere where you have a lot of resprouting, but maybe along waterways or going in and removing invasive species that colonize in those areas. There are other cases where active tree planting makes sense if that's sort of the desired endpoint is a mixed species forest fairly quickly, or there's really slow natural regeneration. In other cases, in the tropics, there's a focus on agroforestry and trying to produce crops from the land, but also diversify it and make it a more heterogeneous habitat where trees are interplanted to provide better habitat for animals. And there's also an argument for planting trees, monoculture tree plantations. That's certainly not the same as restoring forests, but we have to provide our wood and paper pulp from somewhere. So my take-home message here is that the most appropriate strategy to grow trees depends on local ecological and social conditions, and also what the goal of the project is. So as I said, for these tree growing efforts to be more successful, we need to think about the most appropriate strategy. We also need to think about whether land tenure is secure, because in tropical countries, if trees are planted in areas where people don't clearly own the land or have ownership of the trees, then they're likely to be re-cleared. And in those cases where they're small landowners, they need to be compensated for lost income. And how are they making income on the land if they give up agriculture? Then there's a whole series of questions about who will pay for the cost to fence the land, to grow, plant, and care for, and monitor the trees, and protect the site from human intrusion. So not just who's going to put them in the ground, but who's going to do that over the time and who's going to pay for it. And so those are really important questions that need to be set from the outset. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of tree planting failures. And the other really important point for successful tree planting, tree growing, is to plan for permanence. And this means scaling up the quality of the tree planting, not just the quantity of tree growing. We hear that Ethiopia set a world record and they planted 350 million trees in a day, but we really don't know. And I've looked into this, that we don't know how long, what happened to those trees, those seedlings that were planted. And that's a huge investment to not get anything out of it. So maybe rather than saying that we're going to plant 1 trillion trees, the goal should be to have 200 billion trees that are then alive in 20 years. So what planning for permanence means is, again, incorporating stakeholders in the conversation. It also means thinking about selecting species that are likely to survive in a future climatic conditions, because the climate is changing. And so things that we plant now may not be adapted in the future, and trying to pick species that are pretty tolerant of stressful conditions. It also means maintenance, monitoring, and adaptive management over time. You can't just put a tree in the ground, but you need to think about, does that need to be watered? Does it need to be fertilized? Do we need to clear seed around it? And doing monitoring. And I was actually, this last year, I reviewed a bunch of tree planting proposals for the World Economic Forum Trillion Tree Planting Campaign. And even the best proposals, the winners, the longest they were monitoring was for 2 years, which is not how long, as you all know, trees grow and for forests. And so that's something that really needs to change. And another thing that we need to think about is trying to pick places that are more likely to be stable over time. And so this may mean selecting lands that are less productive for agriculture, other uses, so that they aren't re-cleared. So as one example of what I think was a more successful proposal of trying to prioritize lands, this is actually a paper that came out recently about thinking about where we might do increased tree cover for climate mitigation in the United States. And so looking at lower cost and more feasible options to restore forest cover. And what they did was, in addition to doing mapping exercises, which a lot of people have done, they also talked to practitioners in the different regions around the United States and figured out, which were the most feasible and cost effective, and also tailored those approaches to sort of think about and realizing that where we might do tree growing is going to depend a lot regionally. And so just thinking about some of the places that they thought were the most viable to do that, first of all, obviously in areas that are protected, post-burn landscapes, areas that were previously forests and are now used for pasture and probably not at very high densities, so pulling those areas out. Otherwise, trying to pick places that are not super productive for agriculture. So there's challenging soil conditions for agriculture, or they're frequently flooded. And so those are the types of places that we might want to be prioritizing. And of course, another possibility is to be thinking about, where are the urban open spaces where we could do this. And the point here is just, again, thinking about if these projects are going to be successful, where are they most likely to be successful, and thinking about that from the outset, so we don't invest a lot of resources that really don't have the outcomes that are desired. So what I'd like to do now is shift gears a little bit and talk more about my own research. As Greg mentioned, I've taught ecological restoration, or restoration ecology, in the environmental department at UCSC for over 25 years. And I recently had this book come out. And if you're interested, it's a pretty short book, a general overview if you're interested in learning more about ecological restoration. And I do work on restoring ecosystems here in California, including grasslands and coastal scrub along the coast. I work a lot in coastal prairie. And also I would do some work on riparian forest restoration along the Sacramento River. And I'd be happy to answer questions about that, but I'll primarily now be talking about my work on tropical forest restoration, tying back to the first part of the talk. So as I mentioned in the first part of the talk, natural regeneration is one option to regrow forests, but the rates of tropical forest recovery vary greatly. And so we may have cases like this where we have a lot of recovery, but we also have places like this area in the Panama Canal Zone, where after 10 years, you can see very little natural regeneration because of these really aggressive pasture grasses. And so as an ecologist, what I think about is, well, what's slowing the recovery? And then how do we design strategies to help to restore this ecosystem and facilitate forests? And as I said, I'm focusing here now, moving from tree planting really onto restoring forests for the sake of forests and not just in agricultural lands, even though, as I said, I think there's value to all of them. So we know that tropical forest recovery, or succession as we call it as ecologists, in former agricultural lands can be slow. And that's because in really disturbed lands, first of all, the seeds have to get dispersed there. Then the seeds forest species have to survive. Then they have to germinate. And then the seedlings have to survive and grow. And ultimately, we hope that the trees mature and reproduce. And that's affected by a number of different factors. In the tropics, in wet forest, about 75 to 80% of the seeds are actually dispersed by animals, which often don't come out in open areas. And so lack of seed dispersal can be a big factor. Also, the existing canopy has a big effect. There's a lot of grasses in the understory that compete with the seeds and the seedling growth. You can have seed predation and seedling herbivory by animals. You have a stressful microclimatic condition in those open areas that causes species to desiccate. You can have various microbes that can have either positive or negative effects. And then you often have highly degraded soils. And so a lot of my earlier research looked at thinking about, what of these are some of the most important factors? And there are a number of factors, but as I said, some of the biggest ones tend to be this lack of dispersal and also competition with these grasses that outcompete some of the seedlings. So in order to overcome some of these variables, one of the things that is done in tropical forest restoration is to plant native tree species. And what those can do is, as the canopy develops, they attract birds that disperse seeds. They also shade out the pasture grasses, which are really light dependent and create a more moderate microclimatic conditions. Certain species of trees also increase the nutrient availability through their litter fall. But when you're planting trees extensively throughout the area, it can create really homogeneous conditions. So you can think about like tree plantations and rows of trees, and that's not what a forest looks like. It's also costly to plant and maintain those seedlings. So this got me thinking about 20 years ago as an ecologist about how we might do forest restoration differently. And so I started thinking about what's called the nucleation model of recovery. And this was proposed by some scientists almost 50 years ago. And what they noticed was when the forest recovered, that it recovers pretty patchily, and you have little patches of trees, they attract animals. Over time, those patches spread and coalesce. And that's the way the forest recovers. And when they were describing this idea, they were talking about forests in the eastern United States, but we see similar types of processes elsewhere. And so this is an abandoned pasture in Costa Rica, where you see little patches of vegetation establishing. You can see it even in the Santa Cruz Mountains as we're resprouting after fire. It's not that things resprout everywhere, they resprout patchily. So this got me thinking about, as an ecologist, well, if natural regeneration in some systems is slow, and plantation forestry, planting rows of trees, is very homogeneous, then maybe we could do this thing called what I call applied nucleation, but I know it's kind of a mouthful, so I'll also use that interchangeably with the term planting tree islands. So you plant these islands of trees that then attract birds and bats, and over time, they speed up recovery. And the idea here is that it better simulates the heterogeneous natural forest recovery process. And it also requires less resources to implement because you don't have to plant as many trees. So 17 years ago, my collaborator Zach Sahawi and I started a study in southern Costa Rica. This is in areas of lands that were formerly used for coffee or largely now are used for cattle grazing, and it's pretty steep terrain, so it's not very productive. It's right in southern Costa Rica on the Panamanian border. And when we set up the project, we set up quite a number of different sites, 15 sites, because we wanted to make sure that we tested the method across different sites in the landscape. And some of them had reference forest areas nearby that then we use as a comparison. So as I said, we set up 15 sites 17 years ago now. At this point, we have 12 because we've lost a few of the years. We have 3 treatments. The first is just allow for natural regeneration, the sort of yellowish area we don't plant at all. In the plantations, we plant 4 species of trees throughout. And then we have what was called our applied nucleation or islands, where we have 3 sizes of tree islands. We planted 4 by 4 meters, 8 by 8, and 12 by 12 meters with the same tree species we planted here. And what we did is we cleared around the tree seedlings for 2.5 years, and then we just let the forest recover. So to give you an idea what that looks like, this is one of our plantation sites. This is after a year. Here's a person here, that white line. And then these are tree seedlings. In the foreground is a natural regeneration site. This is the same site 9 years later. Here's the person, and here's the tree canopy, which is about 15 to 18 meters tall. And you can see things grow pretty quickly there. In the foreground here, this is a natural regeneration site. And there's not much regeneration there, though I can say I was just there about a month ago. And there are now some isolated trees there, so I couldn't take a newer picture. But that just gives you an idea about the development. So the plantations generally do look like rows and rows of trees. And there's regeneration in the understory. We have one species that has been dying quite a bit, so there are some gaps opening up. In the natural regeneration plots, there's still really dense grasses. And to give you an idea of the grasses that we're working with, this is a person here, and this is the grasses. And so the grasses range from about 1 meter to 3 meters tall. So they're really tall, which is one of the things that inhibits recovery. It's not quite like the grasses in the grasslands here, but we are starting to see trees establish in those sites, but more patchily. And then in the tree island or applied nucleation, this is after about 3 to 4 years, you can see the tree islands. And then over time, what you start to see is that the tree canopies, this is the planted tree canopy on the right and the left side of the blue here. And then these are naturally established trees. And so over time, in fact, the tree islands nuclei are spreading, which is what we hoped. So as I said, we've been studying this for about 17 years. We've collected a lot of data, the trees we planted, and the vegetation structure, but we're also really interested in the dispersal of seeds, and particularly the species that established, because we only planted 4 tree species, but there are hundreds of tree species in these forests. And so we're assuming that they're going to colonize on their own. We've looked at nutrient cycling, epiphytes, lichens, birds, bats, insects, all sorts of different things. I don't know epiphytes, by the way, if you don't know, those are plants that live on trees here. I don't have time to talk about all those, but if you're interested, you can go to my website, and there's lots of papers, and this one in particular that came out last year, so it summarizes the results. There's also a 7-minute video in English and Spanish that you can see a little bit more what the sites look like and what we've been up to. What I'd like to do today is just to focus on a few of the take-home messages from our work. So first of all, what we found is that tree islands and tree plantations are similarly effective in facilitating most plant and animal recovery. This is just one figure. This shows the number of tree recruits per meter squared. So after about 10 years. And what we find is that this is the means are here, and then this is an error bar here, that in natural regeneration, there's not nearly as much tree recruitment, particularly of larger seeded species. In the tree islands and the plantations, they have really similar amounts of recruitment going on. And so that these tree islands or nuclei are just as effective as the plantations. We find this sort of trend for most of the variables that we measured, that the applied nucleation works just as well. We do find that the number of species and the number of trees establishing is less than in the reference forest, which isn't surprising. It's only 17 years. It takes forests a while to recover. Some other variables that we've measured, like leaf litter inputs, we've actually found that the levels in the islands and the plantation treatments are actually similar to the reference forest. They're actually caught up. So it does seem like it's an effective method in the system that we're studying. We've also found that the tree islands spread quickly over the first decade. So after 13 to 15 years, and these are data from about a year ago, or actually 2 years ago, what we find is that the overall canopy in the applied nucleation and the plantations are similar, and they've increased a lot. It's also increased a lot in the natural regeneration plots too. So there is a recovery happening there. It's just slower. However, the canopy is still taller in the plantations. And so we see that there's a lot of canopy cover that's 2 to 5 meters in the natural regeneration applied nucleation. And that in the taller canopy, that it's quite low, only about 11% in natural regeneration. And these are just, again, these are errors, usually looking at the variance between the sites. And then we have, it's intermediate in the applied nucleation, 35%, and the taller canopy is about 56% in the plantations. Third, we found that the larger tree islands were more effective. And so this shows the number of tree recruits per meter squared. This is after about 4 years. And you can see in the large islands, which are 12 by 12 meters, it's much higher. And in the medium islands, they're fairly similar. These are 8 by 8 meters. So we need those larger islands, but our smallest islands, which were only 4 by 4 meters and had 5 trees, we didn't have as much seed dispersal or recruitment. It was pretty similar to what we measured outside the planted area. And we think that the reason that these larger and medium islands, that you have a certain critical island size, is because, first of all, the larger and medium islands attracted more birds, which we measured. We also tend to create more shade to shade out the grasses, which compete with the seedlings. And at this point, we can't really look at the island sizes because they've all sort of merged with one another. But the interesting thing is that we focus on a lot of the ecological factors that affect whether the strategy works. But what we found on the social side is that our tree planting, the applied nucleation or tree islands, it costs less because you have to plant and maintain less trees. In our case, we planted about a quarter the number of trees in our tree island treatment. But we found that there were some social obstacles in the sense that the landowners, we think of like these sort of more heterogeneous ecosystems as a good thing as ecologists, but a lot of the landowners wanted trees planted throughout their land because it looks more orderly. They see value to timber trees. It also demonstrates that the land is being used for something productive. And so that's made us realize that perhaps this is a good strategy in some cases, but it probably makes more sense in large areas, protected areas that need to be restored and there's limited resources, and probably on small land holdings, it may make more sense to do more intensive tree plantings. And this gets back to my earlier message that you have to think about both the ecological and social appropriateness of different restoration strategies. So we now have 17 years of data, which we're really proud of. It's very rare to have that long of an experiment in ecology, and also to have it at so many different sites so we can look at the generalities, because there is a lot of variation across the sites. We're continuing to measure tree growth and vegetation recovery and birds in the plots. And right now what we're really focusing on is what factors affect the recruitment of the later successional forest species, the ones that come in later, and particularly that have large seeds. So you can see this is actually a picture I took a month ago. We do have some really large trees in our plots. And one of the things we're focusing on, this is my graduate student, Francis Joyce, who's looking at seed predation, and we're trying to look at the role of dispersal and seed predation and seedling establishment and what the obstacles are to these later successional species becoming established. The other area that I'm going a lot with that I do in my research is I've talked mostly about Costa Rica, but I collaborate with collaborators in a number of countries. I've done work in Mexico and Colombia and in Brazil, and a few regions of Brazil, because that's a way I really feel like as a scientist from the US that I can be working with in-country collaborators who are doing good work and have in-country connections to actually implement the results of their work. And also because you need to test any strategy in different situations to see when it's most appropriate. So I started a study. One of my main collaborators in Brazil is Pedro Brancaleon at the University of Sao Paulo. And we studied a parallel study to my work in Costa Rica about 5 years ago. And again, this is in the Brazilian Atlantic forest, which is in the eastern part, and it has largely been disforested. There's only small patches remaining. And we set up this study where we looked at planting tree islands in 25% and 50% of the area. And Pedro was also interested in testing out planting strips of trees. And the reason he wanted to do that is because this is in land that's fairly flat, and they do a lot of their tree planting mechanically, and they also loosen up the soil. And so it was a lot easier to do it in strips. And it seemed like this sort of different spatial pattern actually would have the same effects as the tree islands, in that you don't plant the entire area, so it's more heterogeneous, but it might be more practical to actually implement. The other thing that we did differently is we actually planted, he chose 30 species of trees, half of which are animals and half of which are wind dispersed. So we started from the outset with a more diverse suite of species. I wish I could have showed you data today, but unfortunately I just was on sabbatical and was supposed to visit him in Brazil, and we were going to collect data after 5 years, but due to COVID, I couldn't get to Brazil and his team couldn't get out. So all I can say is that at this point, the project is developing. Hopefully I'll get there in the coming year. And you can see that in the 100% planting, this is the red is the taller canopy, these aerial photos, that it's much more homogeneous. And then you have the planting design sort of that matches the amount of area that was actually planted. He's also doing some really other interesting research related to this that I've been involved in advising on. And one of the things he's doing, and this gets back to thinking about what I was talking about before, about trying to come up with how do we pay landowners for restoration and make it economically profitable. So he's been looking at interplanting timber species in strip planting as a transitional stage to help offset forest restoration costs. And so what this means is, sorry, it's kind of a mouthful, is that he's been doing these, working with eucalyptus companies in Brazil. And Brazil is the largest paper pulp producer, and they grow a lot of eucalypts, which are native to Australia. And what they do is they interplant strips of eucalypts and native species. And the idea here is that you plant these eucalypts, which then are logged out after 5 to 7 years because they grow really quickly. And then you have native species left afterwards. And this helps to offset the restoration costs. Now, I know some of you in California who know about eucalypts think it might be kind of horrifying to think about planting eucalypts as part of a restoration strategy. And that's how I felt when I first heard about this. But having visited abandoned eucalyptus plantations in Brazil, I can say that it's a quite different system than what we see under eucalyptus here in California, where you have a lot of regeneration in the understory of native species. And so it's really hits home the point that what strategy is going to work really depends on where you're working and the ecosystem that you're working in. So what it looks like after they log out the eucalypts is that it looks like this. And so you have these strips of native species. And then the idea here is that these will grow up and facilitate establishment of other native species in between over time. And by doing it this way, you haven't had to plant the whole area with native species. And you've also gotten this income, which covers like, I think about 2/3 of the cost of planting from selling the eucalyptus for pulpwood. The other big way that I'm going with my research is really working to scale up restoration projects. And so ultimately, as a scientist, what's most important to me is that these restoration strategies are actually used. And as we're thinking about, how we're going to restore 350 million hectares as part of the Bond Challenge, we really need to be thinking about, are these projects scalable? So recently, I've been working a lot with Conservation International on trying to think about how we could scale up those projects. And so this last year, we just had a publication come out that's a general audience publication mostly for practitioners about how to use this applied nucleation strategy to restore tropical forests. And And that included 6 case studies of where it's actually being used in like Madagascar and in the Osa Peninsula and in Costa Rica and Colombia. And I'm also working with them. Conservation International is working on a project in Rondônia, which is sort of in northwestern Brazil, trying to restore about 1,200 acres of land using this applied nucleation approach, which is pretty exciting for me. And so I really feel like that's sort of where I should be going next as a scientist in the temperate zone who's working with people, is to be collaborating with these groups that are actually trying to implement in those areas, and who also are working with groups, nonprofit groups on the ground in those countries and scientists in those countries who are actually really able to implement their work. So with that, oh, sorry, one more thing, sorry. And what this gets back to too is that, you know, I'm not saying the applied nucleation restoration approach or any of the approaches, restoration approaches I study at work everywhere, but really thinking about working with the local communities and the local, thinking about local ecosystems to figure out which restoration approaches work, both with the goals and the constraints locally and the ecology. And with that, now I'm officially done. I just wanted to say thanks for funding support I've had a lot of funding from the National Science Foundation and also from support from UCSC. A lot of people, as I said, all these works are really collaborative. And if you're interested in more information about my research, you can check out my webpage, and there's a bunch of links to my different projects in both scientific and general audience publications and a few videos too. So thank you very much, and I would be happy to answer any questions. We should have plenty of time for that.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. That was awesome. I loved hearing the updates of your work. Every time I hear you talk about things, I learned something new. And it was great to start thinking a little bit more about this large discussion about growing trees as a way of mitigating climate change. So thank you so much for what you brought today. There's lots of questions coming up. I'm going to actually start off with my own question, just to get things going. So you spend, like I do, a lot of time in the tropics and a lot of time working in California, different places. What is it that you think, if anything, that you have learned from doing all your work in the tropics that has really changed how you look at or your effectiveness or how you do things in California or other temperate systems? What do you bring back?
That's an interesting question. Well, I think that what I bring back from working in different systems generally is realizing that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And so you really have to think about, okay, what's the goal of the project? What's the ecology, and sort of how much different things differ. And, you know, the example I like to use is like in the tropics, seeds don't, the problem in conservation and like reforesting is that a lot of seeds don't have dormancy, and so they germinate immediately. Whereas here in California, we spend a lot of time, we spend a lot of time thinking about how do we get seeds to germinate in our system, because they often have very complex dormancy systems. I think it's also on the social side, it's understanding that to really implement things, a certain amount of humility and thinking about, you know, where it's not just about what I know as a scientist, but how do I work with practitioners to implement this? And I feel more comfortable doing that here in California, where I actually am a resident and I live here. And so I do that more, whereas I try to work with my network in the tropics, but also learning that from those systems that I don't know at all. And I learn a lot more from those people who are actually on the ground doing the restoration projects too, instead of working together. And so I think that's also something that I see in all the systems that I work. But mostly I would say just understanding that there aren't generalities, or you really have to, I mean, there's certain generalities, like you always need to include stakeholders and you need to think about this, but that different systems work really differently. And so what works one place won't work other. And even within the same ecosystem type, that's true. Great,
thanks so much. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the questions that have been coming in. You mentioned eucalyptus and, you know, planting this, and there are a number of questions that are related from Sonia. What is your view on non-native tree species in California, especially eucalyptus? And Robert asks about when it's planted in the tropics, when they're harvesting the eucalyptus, doesn't it just grow back? And so how does that work? And even beyond eucalyptus, there's also a question from Cindy about planting bamboo and research in that area as a way of reducing global warming. So if you'd like to tackle the invasive or the
So the
introduced
eucalyptus
species.
thing. I feel like, every situation is different, and you need to think about, first of all, will that species spread? Will it last over time? And how is it going to alter the system? And so my collaborators in Brazil with the eucalyptus have looked into a lot of things. They've found that the eucalyptus doesn't inhibit and have native species. They've also looked into the water effects we get asked a lot about, that it doesn't use more water than rapidly growing native species. They've looked at whether, how it affects some of the birds, and they found that they still use it. And so they've tried to look at some of the things that we worry about, or a lot of people ask about allelopathy, which is a chemical that affects another plant that's establishing, and eucalyptus in California are allelopathic. I think because the rainfall is higher there, the allelopathy isn't as much of an issue. And so I think we need to be creative about restoration if we're going to scale. And so we need to not take options off the table. We need to research them carefully. And, eucalyptus has a really different effect here in California, but we have to be thoughtful about how we remove eucalyptus here in California, because it has positive effects on certain species like monarchs. And so you have to kind of look at the whole thing. And so I think there are other examples of species that can be planted, but you need to make sure that they're not going to, over the long term, inhibit recovery. And that's what my collaborators in Brazil in the Atlantic forest have really looked at, to make sure that it's not going to have a long-term negative effect. And there are other examples. People have looked at planting pines in some places in Asia, in Molina, which is a really fast-growing pulpwood species in Costa Rica, has been produced. And so I think there are roles, but you want to make sure that it's not slowing recovery or spreading into other ecosystems. As far as bamboo, bamboo is a big problem with spreading, because it spreads a lot vegetatively. And so I think it's one that people have to be really cautious about. And again, thinking about where it's native and it's not, because bamboo is native in some spaces and it does sequester a certain amount of carbon. I don't know the numbers on how much carbon bamboo sequesters. It's not something I've looked into, but it's one that I would really want to research and make sure it's not going to spread, because I have seen, even where it's native, another one of my project that I didn't talk about was one of my students who worked in Colombia, found that when you had riparian zones, even with the native bamboo, it was very low diversity when the bamboo takes over everywhere. And that's partly because people have managed to favor the bamboo because they use it as a building product. And so it's sort of, again, thinking about what the goals of the project are. And there was a question about the resprouting of the eucalyptus, and that can happen, but I think that they have pretty good systems for removing them. And like that one slide I showed, they'd actually, I think they've actually gotten the roots out too, but there can be resprouting. And so something that they have to watch out for there and make sure they fully remove it. I think that answers most of the eucalyptus questions. Maybe not for people who really.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Sure.
Okay, so let's deal with, talk about some of the questions that came up specific to Santa Cruz, and there's a bunch of them for the area.
Okay.
One of them from Mai is, there's sort of a couple of related things. I work in the redwood lumber business, and is it possible to start our own redwood tree planting to offset our use of redwood, and what steps would we take? And related to that, what's the best tree to plant in our own home property in coastal California for capture of CO2?
As far as redwood planting, I have not worked in redwood forests a lot. And what I see, there's a big rush to, redwoods do grow really quickly and you could plant them. And I have not done research on carbon capture of different species. But the other thing about planting redwoods is that particularly after the fire, there's this big push, like we need to plant, but there's a lot of redwood resprouting. And so, I would really think about what the goal is there, because it's a lot of them resprout really quickly on their own, and they're likely to grow pretty quickly if it's in the open areas. As far as which species of trees will sequester the most carbon, I have not, so the amount of carbon, first of all, a couple of things about carbon sequestration. And I should say that I'm not one of those people who does a lot of carbon calculations. I'm more an ecologist, research ecologist, but it's first of all above ground. And then we also sequester carbon in the soils. So people often forget about the soils too. I would say that the most important thing, it depends on how dense the wood is. And so the more dense the wood is, the more an individual tree sequesters, but it also depends how fast they grow. And so if you want to pick something, I mean, redwoods do grow pretty quickly. So that's one. I don't know what the wood density of redwood is. I would say the most important thing is if you plant the tree, make sure you have a plan to maintain it and to make it grow over time. And that's sort of my biggest sort of take home message. I mean, you can plant, I mean, oaks establish naturally and they have pretty dense wood, but oaks tend to grow pretty slowly at the beginning. It depends on the species. They vary a little bit, but I don't, off the top of my head, can't say, which tree species sequesters the most carbon, but I think probably redwoods are probably a pretty good choice, but maybe I should look into the wood density of different, say, like, depends on how dense the wood is, how much carbon it takes up, and then how much it, how fast it grows. And so thinking about kind of those factors.
Great, thanks. There are a few sort of specific questions about the research that you were talking about. Let's look
Actually,
at a few
I have
of
one more
those.
thing to say about the last one. I would also think about, if it's in your yard, or then, plant whatever species that's not gonna, spread. But again, there's a little bit too much focus on forest and tree planting. And I would reiterate that in California, there's also other ecosystems like grasslands, and grasslands sequesters carbon in the soil, not as much above grounds, but there's also chaparral and coastal scrub systems. And again, they're not going to sequester quite as much carbon, but you need to kind of think about the trade-offs there of, what type of ecosystem and biodiversity conservation. So I wouldn't get, particularly in larger areas of natural land, get overly focused on the trees. And wetlands, that's another habitat here that wetlands sequester a lot of carbon in the soil. And that's something that people are going to think a little bit more, we need to be doing more of. So, but sorry, go back to your question.
Okay, so there's some specific research questions. One is a comment from Eric and others about nucleation being such a great idea and the natural solution. Specific questions are, what density are they planted at? And another is, how is water supplied, if at all, to these tree planting efforts for carbon sequestration?
Okay, so as far as nucleation, that's really species specific, how much density you plant. We planted ours, we're about 2.8 meters separation, 3 meters, which is a little more dense in the area of the tropics where I work, where tree grows fast. Usually it's 3 to 4 meters. We were trying to close the canopy pretty quickly. In that manual that I talked about, there were different case studies. In some of the cases, they planted them really dense in the nuclei. I didn't think it was such a great idea personally, because then you're kind of counteracting. If you plant a lot of trees really densely, then you aren't really saving money in tree planting, which I think was one of the sales pitches for it. So we planted exactly the same density in the plantations and the nuclei. But that's really species specific, depending on how fast the trees grow, because you want to, as quickly as possible in our system, shade out the pasture grasses. So you want to get a dense tree canopy, because the sooner you do that, then you don't have to maintain the trees and clear around them. In our particular case, we did not irrigate because it's 3 to 4 meters of rainfall a year. There is a dry season, but the seedlings were not generally dying because of desiccation. In other systems like the work I do on the Sacramento River, I don't actually do the restoration there. Nature Conserving, some other organizations do it, and they found that if they don't irrigate for 3 years to start, until the roots get down to the water table, that you might as well not plant them. And so it really depends where you're working. If you do irrigate, one of the concerns is you need to make sure that you're not, plant roots are sort of plastic, and if you irrigate the surface, then you may send tree roots more up on the surface as opposed to having them go down towards the water table. And so you want to make sure that you probably water less. And there's different ways. I mean, people who do desert restoration actually grow plants in tall PVC pots that are meter tall to train the roots to grow down. So there's really different strategies to how dense you plant, how much you maintain, and it really depends on the system. And this is something I talk about in my book, but today I was talking about tropical forests, mostly wet forests, where the problem is irrigation is not the limiting, or rainfall is not the limiting factor.
Great.
I'm sorry, did that answer?
So yeah, those are great. And your comment about the variation among species leads straight into a question from our friend Larry about what have you learned about defining appropriate microhabitat for different tree species? For example, do different tree species, are different tree species more successful in different landscape positions?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the ways that, I talk about spatially patterned tree planting methods. I talk about, where you do plant, you don't plant, but one of the things that I think the restoration field is doing better with now, in some cases, not always, is thinking about, what species will match the areas best. And as an example, I'll use the work that that the Nature Conserving and others do on the Sacramento River. They used to just go out in the floodplain and plant all tree species. Now they do soil coring in advance to figure out how deep the soil is. They do some habitat mapping to figure out, well, maybe some of those lands were more forested before, but some of them might have been more scrublands. They also have to consider, potential flooding potential. And so, so they've actually come to do a better job of thinking about the soil type and the former habitat type, and then doing more of a mix of some species where you plant more shrubs and some that you plant more trees, depending on where you are on the floodplain. And that's what we need to do. And it's hard for me to say, like, generally, what have I found? Well, absolutely. So we need to think about, well, where does it make the most sense to plant tree, different species, depending on whether it's a moister habitat or a wetter habitat. It also may depend on what the goals of the project are too. So, people ask me, oh, I'm going to use nucleation along a river. And I'm like, well, you might, if your real goal is to make a forest buffer, then maybe you want to plant all the area, but right close to the river, so that helps to prevent erosion and to take up the area. So really thinking about, both what the ecological, template looks like, but also what the goals of the project are.
There were a couple of questions about the social perceptions of the restoration coming in. One of them was about if there's consideration about a note that the island method is much more attractive than some of the other ones, and is beauty emphasized in that process? And from the other side, thinking about the other values, is there increasing value in nucleation versus more spatially standard forestry planting regime approaches?
Well, the aesthetics is an interesting one. What I have found, and it's not just me, I've had a conversation with a colleague of mine, some of people now know Stacy Philpott, who's the director of CASFIS, the farm at UCSC, that the same is true in agriculture, that people in general don't like messy systems. And so even though we as ecologists think that the sort of heterogeneity out there, and like, rather than having a mowed lawn, like a wildflower field is a great thing, people don't necessarily like that as much. And that's what I encountered. And so the nucleation looks nice at the beginning, but then it kind of looks just like a big, naturally covered forest, and it's pretty heterogeneous. And I can tell you, it's kind of hard to walk through. And so that's just what I found. That's not in general, everybody out there, but people generally like things landscaped. And it becomes more and more of an issue when you're doing urban restoration. And it's actually interesting because one of my graduate students, Brooke Constance, who's doing work now on the Sacramento River, is looking at this whole question of where they've planted forests and rows on the Sacramento River compared to natural generation forests and how heterogeneous they are. And he is going to be doing a project, or he's proposing to, he's still in the proposal phase, to use some sort of online game drawing programs to sort of simulate different levels of heterogeneity, and then let people sort of use a slider to show where they preferred, how much heterogeneity they like or don't like. And so I think it'll be really interesting. We'll have a better sense of that after it's done. But in landscape architecture, which is where people sort of put every tree where it is, they really think about aesthetics. And restoration hasn't thought about aesthetics, but I do think it's pretty important to think about, particularly in urban restoration, of like how well accepted it is. So I think that kind of goes down the aesthetic route. I'm going to be really interested to find out what Brooke finds with his simulations of heterogeneity. What was the second part of the question?
The second one is, do you see that there are increasing value in nucleation-derived forests compared to, say, a more forestry orderly regime over time?
It depends on how you define value. I think that the small landowners in the area where I work would see more value, to most of them, to planted trees that provide timber. And they would like as many trees as possible that they see as timber valuable trees. Some of the ones, we didn't give a lot of, one of the things that I would do, lots of things as a scientist, when you set up a long-term study, many things I would do differently. Many mistakes I made. I like to tell students, we all do that. I wouldn't have planted necessarily the 4 trees we planted. We chose them because they were available and because they really rapidly, 2 of them established a canopy. But when in this guide, we're talking about that, we probably need to think about in the nuclei or the plantations, you really need to think about what species people want planted on their land in addition to their ecological value, because people are going to be more likely to keep them standing if they think that they're species that they are of value to them. And so it really depends on how you define value. But I would say probably the most value system is a system that incorporates timber plantings or some sort of agroforestry system in with the plantings where you have crops interplanted in with the timber trees. And that is what a lot of the tree growing that's being done right now is. I would say more of the work that's being done is for some type of agroforestry or plantation than for forest restoration. And there was actually a good article on that by Meredith Martin and Mark Ashton and some other people, sort of looking at why people are planting trees. And by far the biggest amount is for timber and for utilitarian reasons.
So there were a couple of questions about other kinds of values besides utilitarian values or carbon sequestration. One is about animals, that some animal species might not be able to recolonize those restored lands as well as others in those fragmented habitats, and what should be done to approach that. And then the second set is more about soil issues, about rebuilding the soil biodiversity. And in one case, Maya asked about noting that some trees, like in New Caledonia, concentrate silver in their sap. Would it be possible to use these plantings for like cleaning up contaminated sites with these trees, which I know is something you have thought about in the past? So animals and soil.
Okay. So animals, a lot of the animals in restoration depend on what the surrounding landscape looks like and what's left in the habitat there. And I didn't talk about this with respect to my project, but I could put it up, but I won't, just in the interest of time. The second part of the question on the nucleation, which I didn't have time to talk about, is we intentionally set up our project. Our sites are along a range of surrounding forest cover. And so we found we have some that have a lot of forest cover surrounding and some have low forest cover surrounding. And we actually found that at least early on, the amount of forest cover didn't have a huge effect. It did have an effect on the species of birds that we got because you had more forest dependent birds than more forest. And so I would say that as far as attracting fauna, the majority of work that our lab has done, we've done some on bats and some on birds, but that for the birds, some tree structure in the habitat is important, but it's also a lot about it is the landscape around. And so thinking about how you might plant, and there is some work that doing this, like thinking about corridors. I'm fortunate what we discovered in our system, and one of the reasons that the forest cover doesn't have quite as much effect is that in the landscape that I work in Costa Rica, there's still about 30% forest cover there. And there are, in addition to remnant patches, there are some trees in the pastures. There are corridors along some of the rivers. There's what are called living fences when you have trees planted along fence lines, and there's enough trees in the landscape that it seems to allow a number of animals to colonize. In other really heavily deforested areas, and I was just reviewing a dissertation, somebody was working in like palm oil, and they're like the nearest forest remnant patch is 30 kilometers away. They were not finding many colonization. They were looking at insects and spiders, not getting much colonization. So the habitat's important, but also the landscape is really important for fauna. And also another big problem in tropical forests is overhunting. And so, what the pressures are on those fauna, but they are really important for dispersal. As far as soil biodiversity, I think Greg knows more about that than me. As far as soil biodiversity, a lot of it is usually about trying to get plants to colonize and to create a more favorable microclimate, because when it's really hot and dry and the soil is really, temperature, that affects a lot of those species a lot. And so in restoration, sometimes there are specific microbial, forest soil biota that are reintroduced, but for the most part, the assumption is that they will colonize on their own, which probably is not a very good assumption, but that is what happens. There are certain species, particularly if there's a species that associates with a timber valuable tree species, then people have figured out how to reintroduce those species. And one of the things that's done is sometimes to use a little bit of soil from the habitat, like forest soil, put it in the nursery bags so that you actually get some potential colonization from mycorrhizae. But as those guys, Greg is a plant pathologist, he will tell you can also get things that might be a pathogen on those plants. So that's one thing I've learned from Greg in 20 years is that microbes can have positive and negative effects. So maybe if you have anything else to say, I'll answer the silver thing. I don't know about silver. I do know somebody who did a study, Lynn Carpenter at UC Irvine, her students did a study looking at aluminum, which can be really high in forest soils, and looking at whether some aluminum concentrating trees, whether they would actually reduce the aluminum in the soil. And it did not work. And an analogy that somebody else told me was, you sort of think about it as like trying to use a salt concentrating plant to get all the salt out of the ocean. There's just so much in there in a small concentration that it would, even though these species do sometimes concentrate certain minerals, and the reason they do that is because they use them in small quantities, that they're not going to be used for cleanup. Where there have been, and this is not my expertise, but I do teach about it a little bit, is where there are sometimes, sometimes plants concentrate there's certain toxins they do, but I don't think the silver and aluminum, you're going to get those out. Sometimes they can also emit chemicals that help to break down certain compounds too. So there's a whole field of sort of, toxic waste cleanup, but that all depends on what the substance is and how concentrated it is. But I don't think with the silver it's going to work. Did you have anything else to say about restoring soil biodiversity? Greg?
About the soil? Yeah, no, I think you're right on there that the assumption is that a lot of things will colonize, and they probably will. They'll come back, or they'll colonize from other places. And one of the big questions that we have right now is that balance between the beneficial effects of some kinds of soil microbes and the pathogenic and detrimental effects of others, and how those things work together in forest health. It's a huge area that we're just starting to get to understand now. So,
and the studies I've seen, I've been on the lookout for them. Sort of looking at how well the microbial communities come back. There are very few of them. The one I saw was by a guy, Mike Bonner, in some of in Australia, in the northeastern area, there's rainforest there, and they've done a little bit of work looking at how well those microbial communities came back. And the answer was, after I think it's about 15, 20 years, was not very well. They're still pretty different. I think I've also, working in California grasslands, I've often suspected this, but there's been some more studies recently too, suggesting that one of the reasons that it's really hard to get native species back in California grasslands is because the soils have been so disturbed, and there aren't also, some of it has to do with microbial communities too. And you're probably familiar with some of that too, because I know you work in the systems.
Yep.
But so yeah, we just don't know that much about microbial communities because they're much harder to study than birds or whatever. So plants that we can see really easily. And so I think that the microbial communities play a lot more important role than we probably appreciate.
Yeah, I agree, but I'm biased. So there are a bunch of different questions about how to get involved, how to make a difference, about funding, things like that. One is from Luz, is like, how do you get involved in doing restoration projects? Like, and there were others asking about, how can I be an intern? How do we do this?
Well, I don't know where you are, but there are a lot of opportunities here in Santa Cruz County. I should have come with a list of different groups that are looking for volunteers. A lot of my students at UCSC work at, in non-COVID times, work at Younger Lagoon Reserve, which is next to the Marine campus, and doing a lot of coastal restoration. Other groups that come to mind off the top of my head that do restoration work, that look for volunteers on a regular basis. Watsonville Wetlands Watch down in Watsonville does a lot of work. I think it's the first Saturday of the month. Coastal, why am I forgetting the name? Bill Henry. I'm gonna have to look it up right now. And I'm forgetting the name of his organization, which is really embarrassing because I'm on their advisory board. Groundswell Ecology, sorry. Groundswell Ecology does a lot of restoration down on West Cliff and some of the beach areas, and they're often looking for people. A number of the state parks also have days. Linda Broadman and the California Native Plant Society do invasive species removal in a number of the state parks in Quail Hollow County Park. And so there's a number of different organizations that do restoration in this area. trying to think who else, because my students, when they take my class, I'll have to go out and do restoration work day. There's also some with the San Lorenzo River and the Coastal Watershed Council, and some of the work along the San Lorenzo River. A lot of it is invasive species removal, but those are some of the regional ones that do that. But there's a lot of opportunities to do that type of work. It's been limited a little bit by COVID because they can't all, but some of them are, well, at least we're starting to pick up for the Delta variant. But there are opportunities. And so kind of watching, like I said, California Native Plant Society has on their website. So I'm going to forget somebody.
That was a great list. I was nothing jumped out to me. That is a great. There are a number of questions about getting involved in either donating to ongoing projects or also buying land and restoring it. So how do donors to reforestation campaigns make sure that those effects are well planned and effective? Or if you're in a position or interested in buying land and restoring it and making sure that it's going to work for the future, what advice do you have for newbies moving into those areas? How do you make sure that it's working?
It's a really good question. One of the things I've done for about 5 different groups in the last year, I actually have a meeting first thing tomorrow morning with some investors that are doing carbon investing, and also, as I said, I mentioned a review proposal for the World Economic Forum, and for a couple of other nonprofits that are funding projects on a larger scale. And I'm thinking, sort of evaluating whether I thought they were good projects to invest in. And I don't have a list, but I'm thinking now I should probably make a list of some of my top ones that I think people should donate to. But some of the questions that I'm usually asking, particularly this is the ones that I've been reviewing recently, largely are in the tropics, is sort of like, what role are the people in that community playing? And where is the money going? So is it going primarily to like CEOs and a bunch of staff in the United States or in Europe, or is it actually going to the people on the ground? So is it going to people on the ground, and what role do they have in decision-making and running the projects? And so I look for that. I've had to look for it. The proposals are not very detailed. So I've had to look for that on the website. That's one question I ask a lot. The second question I ask a lot is, are they monitoring, and what demonstration do they have that, not just that we put it in the ground. I've been really skeptical of these tree planting apps. And like, I keep asking, like, how do you know that those trees survive? And so do they on their website show something of like about survival rate, how they're monitoring? Are they certified by a monitoring organization? And so those are the types of questions I'm asking about that. And so those would be the sort of things I would be looking at, is, where the money's going. And one thing I was going to say something else is, there's this big thing, and I just talked to somebody who's done research into this, is that the sales thing seems to be telling people that it costs $1 to plant a tree. Well, I can tell you that in most cases, maybe putting it in the ground costs $1, but actually maintaining it over time, making sure the farmers are keeping it there, maintaining it's going to be more than that. And so I wouldn't balk if the price is a little bit higher. I would be looking at, how long are they guaranteeing that tree is going to be there, and how are they monitoring that? Is because that's probably way under sales. And there's a couple of papers that are going to come out soon. I'm asked to review their drafts of like really getting some good economics on how much it actually costs to plant and maintain trees. So that was one. Buying your own land. Well, it depends where you're buying the land. And I would start looking around for what resources are available. For instance, just let's say in California, there's some pretty good guides, like the people that put out like the California Native Plant Society about landscaping with local natives and things like that. And so it sort of depends where you are. If you're in another country, then trying to look for some sort of a local manual, talking to people there, and, getting a sense of, who else has done that. But there's often resources available, particularly with the internet. And I found that most people who are already working on those types of things, so I would really be trying to take advantage of the knowledge, and particularly the local knowledge. I mean, I work in Costa Rica, and I have to say I probably learned more from my Costa Rican field assistants than vice versa, because oftentimes I'll be studying something like, oh yeah, we already knew that, Karen. And so really talking to people there who've been on the land and know what trees grows, and respecting that if you're working in another country, local and indigenous knowledge about what works the best, and looking for those resources. So those would be kind of my pieces of advice on that one. But I'm thinking that one of my my projects needs to be making a list of good tree planting. The World Resources Institute has some that are vetted tree planting efforts. So maybe that'll be one of my projects with my endowed chair to make that list. It is a really good question. And it is hard to find organizations that have a really good, well-documented track record.
So even at a larger scale than those organizations and what individuals can donate to, there are questions about like why hasn't or has our government, say, paid Brazil not to log forests or to plant forests? And would those kind of really large scale government payments be effective?
So the good example there is the Norwegian government has actually put a substantial amount of money. They paid Brazil to reduce their deforestation rate, and they were trying to do the same thing with Indonesia. And if you look at it, I mean, it's a pretty substantial amount relative to the government of Norway to do that. And in the from about 2010 to about 2016, 17, Brazil dropped their deforestation rate in the Amazon substantially. It was really noticeable. And a lot of that had to do with a number of factors. It had to do with the soy roundtable, a lot of negotiations within the government, but it certainly was an incentive that they were being paid to. And there's a whole thing called RED, Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. And a lot of countries have been working on being RED, R-E-D-D, ready, so that they can receive payments for keeping their forest, and the funds haven't flowed as much as possible. So there is signs that would help. Unfortunately, in Brazil right now, under the Bolsonaro regime, there has been rampant deforestation and forest fires in the Amazon. And so unfortunately, there's been a big backtracking on the Amazon, which is a huge concern because it is the largest remaining rainforest, and it has been a big carbon sequester. It's actually now, they're saying, a carbon emitter. But so I think there is a role for funding from governments. And like I said, the Norwegian government showed that it could have an impact, but you also have to have the conditions in country where people are supportive, and the politicians and the people, sort of that goes with it. And so it's a combination of both. As far as the US government, I mean, well, we can go there for a long time. Let me focus on California, because with the whole cardboard and the California having a price on carbon, there's been a lot of discussion on how much we buy offsets elsewhere versus reducing here. And the concern is that you don't want those offsets. Yes, we need to be paying those countries to keep their forest standing and giving farmers payments to do that. And I was just reading a proposal for this meeting tomorrow about, like, they were giving farmers like 50 cents a year. What was it? It was in Timor Leste, to like keep their trees, like they plant trees and then they get 50 cents a year or whatever to like make sure that the trees were alive, which is a good strategy. Like, don't just have them planted, they're alive. Now I got off track there. What was his name? But there's also concerns about that we don't want to distract, that we, as I said very clearly, we need to reduce our own carbon emissions. And so here in California, we should be thinking about how are we driving less? How are we using electric vehicles? How are we consuming, just transitioning to solar, renewable energy and all those things. And so there are some carbon offsets. There's also some carbon there. Have been one of my friends, Virginia Matzik, who's at Santa Clara, has done a lot of carbon, like how much carbon can we restore from riparian restoration and some of the other like oak forest restoration. And so even looking at those numbers within California, how much carbon can we sequester? And like I said, I am not personally a carbon person, so I can't manage those. I don't manage those numbers quite as well, but there are definitely people who are doing those calculations of how much can we get from these different forest types. And there's a lot of assumptions. Any of those carbon, one of the reasons there's so much debate is the estimates of how much carbon we can sequester in forests globally. Like, the numbers vary by an order of magnitude depending on which land you assume is suitable, how fast you think trees you assume which grows, and so there's a lot of assumptions in those models. Okay. I think we're closing in on 7 o'clock.
Yeah, we've got about 4 minutes left.
Okay.
So as someone who works on forest diseases, one of the big discussions happening right now is trying to restore American chestnut to the East Coast forests using genetically modified chestnuts, as well as genetically modified fungi that can transmit the virus that reduces the virulence of the pathogen. So there's a lot of discussion there. And there are questions about, what do you think about using genetically modified species in forests for restoration? And also how important even it is to be thinking about using native species in the restoration efforts.
It's a big debate, and it's hard to, in my opinion, to have complete generalities. I think to the degree possible, you should be using native species. As I pointed out, I think there are some cases where, particularly at the transitional stage, you might use non-native species if they're thinking about their impact. And so I think it's important to kind of keep all the tools in the toolbox, but definitely to native species. As far as genetically modified organisms, again, not the place you want to start, but if you're in a case where you're going to lose the chestnut, then you may need to think about whether you genetically modify the organism. The thing I think people don't realize is how much we have done plant breeding and genetic modification in our agriculture for years and years. And so many of the plant species, so many of the cultivars out there. And so people immediately think you're transmitting genes across different species, but there's also just a lot of plant breeding and stuff that we have done for a long time. And so it's not quite as radical, I think, as we think. But I don't know. What do you think, Greg?
No, I'm with you on that. I think it's not necessarily the first option, but I don't think it's something that needs to be completely ignored a priori either. So
yeah, I mean, in the chestnut's a pretty extreme case. It's like pretty much not present. And so what do you do about that? With something like sudden oak death, we still have oaks around. So I wouldn't be saying we should be going out tomorrow and genetically modifying our oaks, but who knows, if they were all gone.
So there's still lots of questions left. We've only got 2 minutes, but I wanted to bring it back home because there are a number of people who are really concerned about the impact of the CZU fire and other fires in California and what's going to happen afterwards. Are those forests going to recover? What is it that we should be doing to help them?
Well, so far, what I've seen from most of the CZU fire, I mean, I live in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and so what I see around my house, which fortunately did not burn, but it was pretty close, a lot of them are regenerating on their own. And I mean, redwood forests are adapted to fire, and you see this. I live in Felton, and if you go over Felton Empire, a lot of the canopy is still looking pretty good, and so and things are resprouting, and so and it was actually interesting yesterday because I was out going to try to get a photo for the talk, and so much of it was just already like growing back. And so I feel like there are obviously places that are really, I think it's very much a localized thing. There will be a lot of resprouting. One of my biggest recommendations, and this is true in tropical pastures and wherever I work, is give it a year or two and see how much natural regeneration comes back, and then go out and plant. Because what we found in our Costa Rica plots is there's certain plots that are regenerated really quickly and others that are slowly, but those same plots have stayed the same plots over 17 years. And so we actually did the study where we figured out that if we looked at how many seedlings established after a year and a half, that was a good predictor after 10 years. And so I think the same thing is true with the CZU fire, is give it a year or two, see how much regenerates. In some of the areas where it's not regenerates quickly, then maybe we do need to go out and do some replanting. But I think you can see, or like where the Martin Road fire was, there's a lot of regeneration. So, and you also have to think about where it is right along waterways, and you're dealing with water quality, then that might be a place to target planting sooner. But for the most part, I think a lot of it will regenerate. I mean, the bigger question is with climate change, and if fires become recurring, how many fires, because the fire return interval along California coasts, probably natural interval is estimated as somewhere on average of every 100 years. And so if we get multiple fires, then I think we're going to have more of an issue.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Karen. And thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. And please join us on August 18th for our next crawl lecture, Peering into the Body with Less Risk. Good night.